So today we will speak about the definition of breakover and, as I said, some relevant topics, also anatomy, that you understand better what you do in your everyday shoeing. Yeah, okay. So the practical relevance of breakover, I think everybody is more or less familiar with this. We use a change of point of breakover to change hoof conformation. For example, if we work with long toes or horses with a poor breakover, we would like to ease it a little bit, so we change the shoeing, the position of the shoe, or the design of the toe. Yeah, so this is what everybody's doing the whole day. But we also use the change of breakover for discipline-specific shoeing. Yeah, so we all agree that you might shoe a show jumper differently than a dressage horse. Yeah? And this is something we do just by our handcraft, by our experiences. And of course, we try to think about it, but sometimes it's not so easy to find the correct way of changing breakover, of modifications. So I would like to show you some examples today, just to stress a little bit what we really can do by using breakover, or by changing breakover for our shoeing and trimming. How we can definitely affect it, as I said, we will do the next time. But for example, with this case, I would like to give you a little highlight what we can achieve by trimming and shoeing, that you know it is a really important topic. So we see a high-level dressage horse. It's quite well written. The owner has it quite new, and you can see it has uneven feet. It's not non-lame, so it's actually a quite sound horse. 7 years old, a gelding, quite friendly. But the owner complained a little bit about missing asymmetry. Yeah, so you see it in the feet, but also in the locomotion pattern. She's not really satisfied how the horse is moving and how he's lifting the limbs. So if you have a closer look to the hoofs and we measure it, you see if we have the left and the right hoof. So the left one is the yellow one. The left hoof is a very flat hoof, acute hoof angle. The right hoof is steeper than the left one. Yeah, this is easy to see by measuring with black. And if you compare the breakover duration in walk and trot, you see a difference between left and right hoof of 24 milliseconds in walk or 18 milliseconds in trot. So it's not a really symmetric breakover duration according to the hoof angles. In this case, the flatter hoof has a longer breakover duration than the steeper hoof. The steeper hoof is breaking over much faster. But if you compare the flight arc, so if you check the propulsion of the limb to swing phase in the flight arc, you can see that the flat hoof, the acute angled hoof, has a higher flight arc than the steeper one. Yeah, so it's an asymmetry in the motion of the hoof in swing phase, in the height of the flight arc, but also in the sideway motion during swing phase inwards to the contralateral limb. Yeah, you see we have asymmetry in breakover duration and also in swing phase. And we can state right now that breakover is always connected to the motion of the limb during swing phase. Yeah, so if we affect breakover, we might also affect the motion of the limb during swing phase. And if you have a dressage horse like this, you would like to have it more or less even, more or less symmetrical. Yeah, so that you have a nice, good-looking motion picture if you ride it in the arena. So after trimming, we managed to make the acute angled hoof, the flat hoof, a little bit steeper. So we adapted a little bit the hoof angle, and we also changed breakover. We used another shoe, so we made a nice rolled toe so that the breakover is a little bit supported. And you can see it changed quite a lot. So in walk and trot, we just have a bilateral difference in breakover duration of 8 milliseconds or 3 milliseconds. So this is more or less nothing. Yeah, so it is a quite symmetrical breakover duration. And you can see also in swing phase, we have a nice symmetrical flight arc of 13 centimeters. So this is a quite nice result. So the horse is moving in swing phase much more symmetrical. So for a dressage horse, this is a quite nice result. It is not always that you can plan it. Yeah, so it's not always easy to affect the breakover duration and have such a nice result in the swing phase, but it shows there is a correlation, and we can achieve quite a lot if we just try to make it a little bit easier for the horse. Yeah. And we all know that breakover has also a relevance in orthopedic cases. I think there we use it even more. Yeah, so we all know that there are several diseases where it's really nice to support a little bit the palmar structures. You have the navicular syndrome. We will talk about it a little bit later, but also in laminitic cases or horses with negative palmar angles, or if you have injuries of the flexor tendon or arthrosis. All these diseases benefit if you make it easier for the horse and the hoof to break over. Yeah. This is known. We will repeat a little bit the anatomical structures that you have a kind of overview again, because I think to understand the next webinars, you need to understand the structures we are talking about. Yeah. And that's why I gave you a little overview. But first I would like to show you another case. We have a 13-year-old lame horse, so it's quite lame on the left front, and the diagnosis is podotrophlosis in both front limbs. Yeah, so you have it more severe in the left one, but still the disease is more or less present in both limbs. The horse was not really comfortable in both forelimbs, I think, and you also see again we have a quite uneven angle in the front feet. Yeah, it's quite often if you have chronic podotrophlosis that you have an uneven hoof angulation as well. Yeah, and again we made it, of course, you can see it, we made a little bit pad and packing, quite soft everything, and we also placed the shoe a little bit, we trimmed a little bit, and we also made a nice roll toe to give a little bit easier break over. And if we compare the results, we have here, you can see it before shoeing, we have a quite steep left hoof, and we have quite acute right hoof in red. And if you see the trot, yeah, if you see the break over duration in trot, you can see we have a bilateral difference of 25 milliseconds. And I can already tell you that pain or lameness is affecting break over duration quite a lot. So more or less all the times, or at least very often, the lame limb has always a quite longer break over duration. So the horse tried to relieve the limb. It's harder for it to break over. So that's why the break over duration in the lame limb is more or less always or often at least longer than in the sound limb. Yeah, so we have a bilateral difference in this case. After shoeing, we made it a little bit more comfortable. The lameness improved, and this is really nice result, but you see that the break over duration is absolutely symmetrical. I mean, this is a highlight. I can't say that this happens all the time, but now you see the horse benefits from the shoeing. It is more comfortable. We eased break over, and you directly see it in a more symmetrical break over duration. Yeah, so you can see break over is indeed a parameter. We can have a direct effect, a short-term effect, and also we will see the next time long-term effects. Yeah, so this is something quite nice, because we have other parameters where we have more influences and it's not so easy to affect them. I will show you, I think, something about swing phase or about initial contact later on. But today we focus on breakover because it's one of the parameters most important for your everyday shoeing. Yeah, and it's really important to understand the meaning of breakover. I think the first case already showed you that breakover is very important for the motion of the limb to swing phase, because it's actually the phase where you transfer the forces to the ground as the last part during stance phase for limb propulsion to swing phase, yeah, to make it more or less airborne. Yeah, so it's really important phase to enable an active gait. So the horse is really pushing off from the ground. It transfers high forces to the ground, and of course you have high strains on the hoof and the joints and all tendons and ligaments. But this push off phase is very, very important to have an efficient and sound and nice gait pattern. Yeah, again, for repetition, we will have a closer look in a minute, but during stance phase, in the second half of the stance phase, the deep digital flexor tendon introduce the extension of the coffin joint, and you can see it's pulling more or less the hoof to the ground. So you have the breakover more or less introduced by the deep digital flexor tendon. Yeah. And again, it's very important to understand breakover and some forces to the ground is necessary to have an active gait. So if you have a dressage horse or horses competing in gait disciplines, you would like to have a quite impressive high flight arc in swing phase. So it doesn't make any sense to reduce breakover too much. Yeah, horses need breakover. They need a kind of resistance and a kind of moment arm to have a quite efficient and nice flight arc. So we have more or less a little bit discrepancy between easy breakover, but also efficient locomotion. Yeah, so it's not necessary to have a very, very smooth breakover the whole time in horses, for example, who are competing in dressage or where you would like to have a nice gait pattern. Actually, you would like to have both. You would like to have a less moment arm, but also some grip. Yeah, in the sports shoes of humans, you see it quite nice. Yeah, you have, of course, a kind of nice roll toe. Yeah, nice breakover, but still you need some resistance. Otherwise, it's too much effort for the muscles to have a nice limb propulsion to swing phase. So that's why the shoes from the humans are more or less designed with a roll toe, with a nice breakover, but still with some grip, like the spikes. Horses don't have spikes, but this is one reason why we try to give a little bit resistance in the shoes of the dressage horses in the toe to make it a little bit easier to lift the limbs to swing phase. Yeah, just keep it in mind. Usually it's quite nice to ease breakover if it's fitting for the conformation or for the orthopedic case, but be a little bit careful in sports horses to enable an active and efficient gait pattern, yeah, to make it easier. So, and if you have a closer look on the definitions, because if you Google or if you try to find some literature, you will find a lot about breakover, but breakover is quite often defined in very different ways. Yeah, so you have to make the effort to find out what they mean if they say breakover. And one aspect of breakover is, of course, the timing. We already spoke about it. Yeah, so the breakover duration is defined from heel off to toe off. Yeah, the time period from heel off to toe off. And it's also quite important to make a little separation between the phases of breakover. Yeah, so we have the phase shortly before breakover, then we have the early breakover and late breakover. Yeah, this sounds a little bit academic, but in a minute I would like to show you why it's important to sometimes think about the different phases of breakover, because in all of these phases, different structures experience the maximum load. Yeah, so that's why we talk about it. Yeah, and if we have a closer look to on breakover duration, we made own studies, so we had some research going on. One result about breakover is already published, so you can see it in a veterinary record. And we used sound warm blood horses or sound crossbreed horses to just check the basic duration of breakover in front and hind limbs. So there's not a lot of literature for the hind limbs. So now we have the possibility to measure all four limbs. And you can see that the hind limbs has a shorter breakover duration than the front limbs, at least in walk. And trot, it's not so obvious. The difference is not really significant. Why? I think it's because of the difference between the two gaits. And in trot, the horse has another locomotion pattern, but we can't really explain it completely, but we will continue with some research. But it's quite interesting that in walk, you have a difference between front and hinds, and it is a significant difference. So the fronts need longer to break over than the hinds. This might be related to the fact that the hinds are really the motor or the engine of the horse. Sorry, they are the engine of the horse. So the horses try to really push the hinds, so it's quite short, breakover is shorter. And then the fronts, the whole body is more or less going over the fronts. They are acting as a leverage, so there you need more time for breakover. Yeah, so that might be the difference between the duration of breakover, that you have different functions between hind and front limbs in the whole horse. Yeah, and if you have a look what is really influencing breakover duration, then it's very obvious that it is a really speed dependent parameter. Yeah, so the faster the horse is walking, the faster is breakover duration. This might sound a little bit very logical to you, and you say, okay, this is obvious, but there are other time phases of stance phase who are not so sensitive against speed differences. For example, mid stance is not so sensitive against speed differences than, for example, breakover or landing. Yeah, so breakover is very sensitive. The faster the horse is, the faster is breakover. That's why in Werkman Black we have a correction in, which is correcting different measurements from different times against speed differences. So if you would like to compare the measurement from before shoeing against after shoeing, yeah, we have a correction in there that the speed is always corrected for both measurements, that you can compare it. Yeah, otherwise, it's really difficult to compare different measurements or examinations. Yeah, and it's also quite different to walk always the same speed if you measure. So you have to have a very consistent handler, I would say, but even this is not possible. So you don't have to make too much effort. There's a correction in there. So we learned from this. And then there's a theory that the hoof angle is also influencing the duration of breakover. I gave you here in this, I give you here 2 examples. We have one horse with quite uneven feet with a steeper and an acute hoof. And you see, of course, in walk and trot, in particular in walk, we have a bilateral difference. In trot, actually not really, but in walk, it's obvious. In the lower row, you see another horse where you have more or less even hoofs. Yeah, the angle is absolutely even. So we have a nice symmetry between the hoofs, but still there's a difference in breakover duration. Yeah, so it doesn't mean that a horse which has symmetrical hoofs automatically has a even or symmetrical breakover duration. This is quite often not working. Yeah. So we have to expect, or we have to accept that we have a bilateral difference between left and right limbs. Yeah, this might be related to asymmetries in the whole locomotor system, in different muscle status. So sometimes you have some tension in the one side and the other side. You have handiness in horses. Yeah, so you have horses preferring the left or the right side. You might have different tendon properties. So there are so many facts which are explaining bilateral differences in horses that we have enough material to explain why horses are not having automatically a symmetrical breakover. Yeah, but we prefer it in particular in sport horses. But here's another example. There is indeed a theory, if you have a steeper hoof angle, you should have a reduced moment arm on the coffin joint. Yeah, so the shorter the toe, the less moment arm. And this should mean actually a shorter breakover duration. Otherwise, if you have an acute hoof angle with a longer toe, actually the distance the hoof has to break over is longer, and breakover duration should be also longer. Yeah, so this is the question. And if you ask this particular horse, you see we can't prove this theory. Yeah, it's the opposite. We see that the steeper hoof has a longer breakover duration than the flatter hoof, or the more acute hoof. And again, here we just have to ask ourselves what could be the reason for this result. It might be you have to ask yourself, what is the reason for having such a bilateral difference in hoof angulation? So it might be that this might have been a club-footed foal. Yeah, so maybe the tendon property of the left hoof is different than the right one. You can also have a long-term adaptation of the whole locomotor system, of the muscles or other tendons. So the whole locomotor system is adapted to this conformation, and it might have been a long-term existing conformation. And we can't just make it as a machine that we say, okay, the breakover duration is just dependent on the hoofs. So hoof angulation is often not just the only reason for having a difference in breakover duration. Yeah, and now we speak already about another definition of breakover. Sorry, it is also the distance the hoof has to break over. So the leverage or the moment arm acting on the coffin joint And usually you use the rotation center of the coffin joint as a reference, yeah, to define the length of the toe or the length of the dorsal aspect of the hoof. Another reference point for defining breakover distance is the tip of the distal phalanx. Yeah, so it depends where you look at, but in the end, both parameters state a kind of moment arm acting on the distal phalanx or the coffin joint. Yeah. This is also influenced by different factors. We already saw hoof conformation definitely influence the distance the hoof has to break over. Yeah. But again, it's not the same as breakover duration. Yeah, it's just a kind of mechanical parameter, let's say it like this. And you have also differentiate between horses having an inherent hoof conformation, a long-term acquired or a short-term acquired hoof conformation. My feeling is that horses having a short-term acquired long toe, for example, and you trim or shoe it differently, you have a direct effect indeed on the breakover duration as well, so also on the timing aspect. But in horses where you have inherent or long-term acquired hoof conformations, this might not be the case. Yeah, so there you have many other parts of the locomotor system who has already adapted to this specific conformation and gait pattern. Yeah, but so this is really can make the effort and have a closer look on horses with a long grown toe, for example, and you trim and shoe it and check breakover. And you can also measure horses where you have a long-term acquired clubfoot or a long-term acquired long toe. So you will see definitely different measuring results. Yeah, so we already said also hoof growth influence the distance the hoof has to break over. Usually a lot of horses growing in the toe, so the toe gets longer during the shoeing or trimming interval. And of course, we have less supporting area and a long leverage acting on the coffin joint. In quite steep hoofs, if you have a little bit club-footed hoofs or horses, then often heels are growing, so we don't have a really long leverage, but we have a little bit more material in the heels. So you can't say always that hoof growth increase leverage on the coffin joint, but in most of the cases it is like this. Yeah, this is what I mean. If you have a measurement from a horse, like on the right side with a long toe, with a really long trimming or shoeing interval, and you will measure it before and after trimming, you will definitely see a change in the breakover duration. If you measure one of the horses in the upper row, the upper images, you will maybe not see a lot of effect of your trimming because, how I said, the whole locomotor system is adapted to a specific conformation. But I can promise you, if you join the other webinars, we will speak a lot about parameters influencing the whole locomotion pattern of horses. There are very, very complex mechanisms who influence the motion of the limb. Yeah, so it's not just the hoof and it's not just our work. We have the central nervous system and some other parameters influencing our work and locomotion of the horse itself. So, and then we have a last aspect of breakover. It's also the point of the last hoof ground contact. So in our research, at least, most of the horses break over the lateral toe. Some of the other horses break over the medial toe, and very, very few horses break over the central toe. So they have a very straight breakover pattern. And the pattern of breakover is very individual. So it belongs to the individual locomotion pattern of the limb and of the whole horse. And now we can ask the question, why have so less horses a very straight central breakover? Yeah, and this is explainable by asymmetries in the joint surfaces. You see nice images from Mike Savoldi. He allowed me to use it, and you can see that the hoof, but also the bones, also the coffin bone, yeah, the distal phalanx is asymmetrical. And the joint surfaces are also asymmetrical. So that means actually these joints, yeah, the coffin joint, the pastern joint, the fetlock joint, they are more or less designed for motion in the sagittal plane, so extension and flexion. If you have asymmetries in the articular surfaces, yeah, so you always have a little bit more rotation or a little bit more sideway motion of the limb during, for example, extension and flexion. So that's why horses can't break over absolutely straight, as long as they are not completely symmetrical. Yeah? So if you have a really symmetrical horse by all joints and with all bones, then you might have a very straight breakover. But usually we all are asymmetrical. So that means that you will always have a tendency of breaking over the lateral or medial toe. Yeah? And again, we said it already, the breakover influences also the motion in the swing phase. So the sideway motion in swing phase will be also influenced by the way of breakover. Yeah, so there is a theory, if you have horses break over medial or lateral, and you try to force them to break over the central toe, you will create rotational forces or torsional forces before and after breakover. So that means you increase sideway motion in swing phase. Yeah, it's a theory. We haven't proved it yet, but maybe you can have an eye on it. And I think it's always a good solution to enable a wide breakover and don't force them to break over a specific point of the toe. Yeah, so we should respect the conformation, the anatomical structures of the horse and their own individual gait pattern. Yeah. So we will speak now a little bit about the forces acting on the different structures during different phases of breakover. And again, you see now a video, X-ray video of a sound horse from initial contact to mid-stance and the breakover process. And you can see how the extension during breakover increases during the final part of stance phase. Yeah, so it's quite impressive how much motion, how much extension is in the fetlock joint during the second half of the stance phase. You can also have a little look on the navicular bone. It's also changing a little bit position depending on the pressure the deep digital flexor tendon is pressing on it. And you can also have a little look on the tip of the distal phalanx during the final breakover. Yeah, you can see several effects which are showing the high stress on the hoof during the breakover process. Yeah. And if you have a look on the different phases, shortly before breakover, the deep digital flexor tendon is pulling quite a lot. So you have high strain in this tendon. So it's making a lot of pressure on the navicular bone. And during early breakover, of course, extension in the coffin joint increases. And during late breakover, we have high forces acting on the dorsal aspect of the hoof. That means on the suspension of the distal phalanx and the tip of the distal phalanx. Yeah, so we will have a look on all these aspects, but keep in mind, we have different phases, so we have different forces acting on different structures. And we start shortly before breakover or during early breakover. As I said, the deep digital flexor tendon is pulling, making a lot of pressure on the navicular bone. That explains why this region is so sensitive. Yeah, so next to the fetlock joint, the navicular region is one of the most sensitive areas in the horse, and you have a lot of pathologies there. Yeah. And we have to remember a little bit, now we make a little bit anatomy, I hope you like it, but you have to, if you would like to understand the forces acting during breakover, you need to understand the tasks of the different tendons. Yeah, tendons themselves are stiff ligaments connecting muscles to bones, and they transfer the muscle forces to the bones and move joints. Yeah, this is the task or the meaning of tendons. And we have two different, let's say, function of tendons. We have stabilization and active force transfer, but we have also tendons which store energy and transfer it to kinetic energy. So they support the elastic recoil during the second part of the stance phase. I will give you both tendons and describe their function. So we have the superficial flexor tendon. I think you all know it. It's a quite thin tendon. So compared to the deep digital flexor tendon, it's quite thin. So the cross-sectional area is not really wide. So the superficial flexor tendon is the smaller one from both flexor tendons, and it's running over the fetlock, of course. And then you can see, yeah, so under it you have the deep digital flexor tendon, which is much wider. So the superficial flexor tendon is inserting at the pastern bone in this area. So, and we said it's quite thin. You don't have a lot of chondrite cells. So it's a very, very elastic tendon. Yeah, compared to the deep digital flexor tendon, the superficial one is very elastic. Yeah, again, a little repetition. Now we see the deep digital flexor tendon, which is wider, which has also a check ligament, which is supporting it, which is a little bit holding it. Yeah, so it's a quite stiff tendon because you have a wider cross-sectional area and you have chondrite cells, it's like cartilage, embedded in this area running over the fetlock and also in the area running over the navicular bone. And this tendon is inserting at the distal phalanx. So this is the tendon actively moving the distal phalanx and flexing the coffin joint. Yeah. So if we compare the properties of both tendons, you can see that the superficial flexor tendon, because it is so thin and it is without any chondrite cells, it has a quite good property with elastic deformation. So you can have a strain of 12 to 16% of its actual length. So this is quite a lot for a tendon. So the task of the superficial flexor tendon is to store energy in the first half of the stance phase, and then in the second it gives it back, so it passively support breakover during the second half of the stance phase. This is in contrast to the deep digital flexor tendon, which is quite stiff, yeah, so it can't really stretch, and this tendon has the maximum strain in the second half because it actively introduces breakover. So this is the difference between both tendons. Both tendons are involved in breakover, but the superficial one is just passively supporting the breakover process, while the deep digital flexor tendon is actively flexing the coffin joint. Yeah. And as we said, yeah, the deep digital flexor tendon is running over the navicular bone. Yeah, the number one here is the navicular bone in this cross section. And you see it's inserting at the distal phalanx. And again, this is a very sensitive region because the distal limb and the toe is already in hyperextension. So this tendon and the navicular bone are always under stress, independent if the horse is running or standing. Yeah, and you can see the navicular bone is also has also quite nice blood vessel system running through the whole bone. You see the little vessel canals in the bone. This is normal. Yeah, they have to be there, but just in a normal small manner. Yeah, so not too big. And the navicular bone is also supported or also suspended, you can say, by own ligaments. And all these parts, so the navicular bone, the deep digital flexor tendon, the navicular ligaments, and the bursa, like a little bursa here between the tendon and the navicular bone, they all belong to the podotrochlea. So the podotrochlea is consistent out of all these parts, which I have explained you in this image. Yeah, and we all know the pathology. So there are horses having podotrochlosis. It's not the same like inflammation, yeah, in the beginning at least not. In the beginning, it's actually just a chronic disorder of the navicular region due to degenerative and progressive destruction of the navicular bone, and in the end, all structures I told you. So in the end, we go a little bit back, that during breakover or during standing, the deep digital flexor tendon is pushing or making a lot of pressure on the navicular bone, and you can see the sensitive blood vessels running through the bone. So there's a theory that too much pressure on the navicular region cause a kind of misnutrition or a little bit missing blood supply in the navicular bone itself. So that means that the bone around the blood vessel canals is destructed, and in the end, the whole bone lose its stability and function. And in the last phase of this disease, you will have also the ligaments and the deep digital flexor tendon and the bursa involved in this pathology. Yeah. So you have in the end something like cystis, or you have a cartilage destruction, or you can see the deep digital flexor tendon and how it is really inflamed and sticking and not really moving appropriate to have a kind of good function, also not doing breakover. Yeah, that's why we try to relieve this diseased region by ease breakover, by modifying the toe. We will see the next time how we can achieve it and to which amount we can really change pressure on the navicular bone. There were some really nice studies, and it is proved if we modify breakover, you will have a very good effect to relieve the navicular region in horses. How I said, there's always a little discrepancy. So if you have orthopedic cases, it's, I think, always a good solution to ease breakover. If you are speaking about a sport horse, you have to give them a little bit resistance to do their work, but without overstressing or overloading the navicular region. Yeah, so it's up to you to find the best solution for each horse. So now we have a look at the final part of the stance phase, or during late breakover, when the last point or the last part of the toe is contacting the ground. Yeah, if you see, if the forces are transferred to the ground, you have high forces acting or high pressure acting on the tip of the distal phalanx, and you have high strain in the suspensory apparatus of the distal phalanx. Yeah, so fibers running from the distal phalanx through the lamellae of the dermis to the hoof capsule. So you have a tight connection there. And of course, if you have the final part of stance phase, you have high strain in this area. Yeah. For repetition, in particular, the tip of the distal phalanx is really sensitive against pressure and forces, because the distal phalanx is not a really strong bone. The distal phalanx is like a sponge, more or less. Yeah, you have a lot of holes, and in these holes you have a lot of blood vessels for nutrition of this bone. Yeah, and if you see, compared, for example, to a humerus or big bones, this little bone is not able to bear a lot of weight and pressure. Yeah, so that's why we should be aware our main task is actually to protect the distal phalanx. Because if you have a closer look on the blood vessels, you see one blood vessel here on the distal margin of the distal phalanx. So this arteria is the terminal arteria running here on the distal margin on the edge of this bone. And this is very sensitive against pressure. So if you have too much load, too much pressure on the distal margin of the distal phalanx, you will have less blood there, of course, because too much pressure means that you have less blood circulation in this area. And of course, if you have less blood circulation, the bone will be destructed. And if you have bone destruction, it will not come back. So it's not possible to grow bone again. Yeah, and this is also some nice study from Mike Savoldi. So you see a quite young coffin bone from a very young horse. It's already adult because you see that the palmar processes are completely developed and calcified. And in most of the horses, you see things like this. Yeah, so often in older horses, you see that the tip of the distal phalanx is missing or is destructed. You have bone loss in this area. And this might be also related to the fact that the distal phalanx itself is in a little bit steep position inside the hoof capsule. So usually you have a normal palmar angle of 2 to 6 degrees. And the tip of the distal phalanx is always the part who is transferring the forces to the ground. So you have the highest load in normal horses or a little bit steeper hoofs here in the tip of the distal phalanx. Yeah, so that shows how sensitive this little bone is. Yeah. So if we manage to ease breakover, we will see the next time we will also reduce pressure peaks on the dorsal aspect of the hoof. Yeah, and this would also mean that we have less strain in the suspensory apparatus of the distal phalanx. Yeah, because we all know that we have the lamellae, we have the dermis. Yeah, somebody counted it. We have 500 to 600 primary lamellae, and they are tightly connected to the epidermal, like the hoof capsule lamellae. And this is a very tight connection, but still, yeah, it is just a connection. So you have some strain there. So in each step, in each breakover, you will have increasing strain in this tight connection. Yeah, and if you see the fibers running, the collagen fibers as the basis for the lamellae, running in a steep angle, a little bit upwards. So you see it's kind of steep angulation because the collagen fibers of the dermal lamellae, they are actually the how we call this? They are responsible to counteract the strain of the deep digital flexor tendon. Yeah. So I made a picture here. So you have the suspensory apparatus of the distal phalanx. Yeah, and you see the collagen fibers from the dermal lamellae running in a steep angle. So that means that these fibers, the tight connection between the lamella of the dorsal aspect of the dermis and the epidermal lamellae, they are responsible to counteract the strain and the pulling of the deep digital flexor tendon. It's not the extensor tendon, yeah, it's the suspensory apparatus. And if you imagine that during breakover is the deep digital flexor tendon pulling, yeah, so you have a high strain in the palmar region, but this also means in particular during late breakover that you have high strain in the suspensory apparatus in the final part of breakover. The easier breakover is, the less strain we have on the suspensory apparatus. Yeah. And we all know the pathology. So if you have laminitic courses, we lose the antagonist against the strain of the deep digital flexor tendon because we have a destruction, we have an inflammation of the suspensory apparatus of the distal phalanx. So the deep digital flexor tendon win. That means we have a rotation, and due to the missing suspension of the distal phalanx, often a sinking. Often we have sinking and rotation. We don't have to speak about laminitis now, but now we understand also the meaning of breakover or easy facilitating breakover in laminitic courses. Yeah, that means if we manage to make it easier for laminitic courses to break over, we have different effects. We have less strain in the deep digital flexor tendon, and again, in particular, we have less strain on the dorsal aspect of the hoof. So that means we can relieve the diseased suspensory apparatus of the hoof. And again, if we don't do it, we see it here, we have high leverage acting on the dorsal aspect of the hoof capsule. And if we have high leverage and missing suspension, missing connection, we can see that the whole hoof capsule is also rotating. Yeah, so again, if we make it easier for laminitic horses to break over, we can also support or reduce the destruction of the whole hoof capsule. Yeah, that was just a little overview. How I said, it is a kind of appetizer. So the next time we will speak in detail how we can influence breakover, the timing aspect of breakover, but also the leverage, the moment arm acting during breakover, and what it means for the deep digital flexor tendon and the navicular region and the whole hoof capsule. So there will be the next webinar in June, and it will be related to trimming and shoeing and its influence on breakover. And I hope it was not too basic for you. I hope I could give you some information tonight. And I think we are ready for some questions. Mehmet, are we?
All right. If anyone has questions, first please unmute yourself, and then you can just shoot it. And just as a reminder for the people, of course, who are missing, this webinar will be also on our YouTube page, so you can have a look at it. Also in the German version from yesterday, it will be there tomorrow. And yeah, like Jenny said, next time we are willing to see more, and we are going to also report it a little bit earlier, just inform you a little bit earlier. This time it was let's say a little bit miscommunication, but next time it will be better. And I thank you also a lot, Jenny. Every time you amaze me, but this is also how it should be, I think. Yeah. All right. So thank you, everyone.
Guy,
And
do you have a question? Or Mareike? No, you should give them a chance if anybody has a
okay,
question.
I'm checking.
Otherwise, they can also write it by email, maybe, I don't know.
Yes, if you have questions, you can also send us an email. It is, you can send it to mehmet@werkmanhoefkeer.com or just send it to our general email, which you can find on our webpage. I'm checking the chat module if there are any questions there. I don't see anything. For Philip Petrich, yes, we are uploading the webinars. I'm planning to do it tomorrow. First, I need to edit it a little bit. And I'm checking the other questions. No, Jenny, I don't see any questions. So we wish everyone a good evening and till next time.